So, the 30th anniversary of Mega Man wasn't a total bust after all, with Capcom announcing a brand spanking new Mega Man 11 coming late 2018. That is, unless it gets cancelled at the last minute, which wouldn't surprise me by any stretch of the imagination, but nevertheless, I figure it's about time we caught up with the rest of the mainline classic series, and so we start the journey with Mega Man 7. As soon as I figure out how to fit the game into the console, it's a little smaller than I remember, but... 1994 saw Capcom release Mega Man 7 for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, a system that already had two Mega Man X titles under its credit and a rather interesting soccer game with Mega Man characters. I can remember reading about this in an issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly magazine and was initially surprised with the notion that Vanilla Mega Man was going to get a Super Nintendo entry. Surprise turned to minor excitement before I stopped and asked myself, why? Why is there a Mega Man 7 on Super Nintendo? Despite the to-be-continued teased at the end credits, Mega Man 6 had given the series a rather satisfying conclusion, with Dr. Wily jailed once and for all and the world finally at peace, allowing for the next generation of Mega Man to take the spotlight, so to speak. And Mega Man X, the spiritual successor to the classic run, had firmly established itself as a viable presence on the Super NES with two hit games. Therefore, was there really a need for Mega Man 7 on the SNES? The answer I eventually came up with was, who cares, it's a new Mega Man, I can't wait to rent it. And so the minute I saw Mega Man 7 available for rental at my local video store, another relic of ancient times, I rented it, took it home, and played it. And I liked it. It was like playing old school Mega Man, except slower and chunkier, but still I liked it enough that I would revisit the game with numerous rentals over the next couple of months it was available. Never got around to buying it because Super Nintendo games back in the day were crazy expensive, and nowadays they're even more so not much has changed there. Even many years later, I found myself paying a pretty penny for this one, but nowhere near the ridiculous prices people are asking for it now, but I digress, back to Mega Man 7. Mega Man 7 sees perennial baddie Dr. Wily breaking out of jail with the assistance of 4 sleeper robots, and as such, more havoc is caused around the world and it's up to Mega Man to save the day. Except, who is this mysterious robot he encounters along the way, and why does he look like a fish? Mega Man 7 alters the formula established in previous NES titles to a certain extent. The premise was still largely the same. You picked your level, you played through it, you fought the boss, you beat him, gained his power, that sort of thing. It's still the same deal. But now there are some additions and deviations from the formula that make it a somewhat different experience from the NES offerings for better or worse, and only some of these aspects would survive into the 21st century. Typically, a Mega Man game has you picking from 8 stages. You play through them, and once all 8 were cleared, you tackle the final set of levels. Mega Man 7, on the other hand, opens with an introductory level similar to Mega Man X. And once you cleared that level, you get to choose from one of 4 stages as opposed to 8. Once you cleared those 4, you played a quick intermission level, and then clearing that opens up 4 more stages, and then it's off to the final Wily levels. It is, for all intents and purposes, the same format used in the Mega Man titles on Game Boy, and while the setup might seem baffling considering we had no problem starting with the full 8 robots in the X games, from a story perspective, it does make sense to go this route. Not so much with Mega Man 8, but that's jumping ahead here. Mega Man 7 also introduces a shop mechanic. Actually, it's like another carryover from the latter Game Boy titles, where you can buy items using the bolts you collected along the way throughout your adventure. Of course, some of the more costly items can be found in the actual levels if you search around, but it's a good addition nonetheless, especially if you want quick energy tanks, weapon tanks, and super tanks on the fly. Of course, Rush is along for the ride, and they brought back his old forms, Rush Coil and Rush Jet, combined the 2 Rush suits from the previous game to form a new one, and added a couple other nifty items to help you out, such as the Rush Search adapter, which allows Rush to dig up items or sniff stuff out. Rush Search might seem superfluous, maybe even worthless, but it's good for digging up little bits of recovery items that might randomly pop up along the way. And if Rush barks, that means there's either a secret to be found within close proximity and you better look around a bit, or he might come across an item that's valuable, either mega screws that will allow a little more spending money in the shop, or perhaps even one of those high-priced items I mentioned. And that's always nice. For the most part, Mega Man 7 plays similarly to the old Mega Man games on the NES, and the control is responsive, functional, and does precisely what you need it to do at the time you need it. You could still run, jump, shoot, slide, charge, and whatever else with relative ease, and in a bit borrowed or taken from Mega Man X depending on your perspective, you can use the L and R triggers to quickly cycle through any master weapons you may have acquired over the course of the game, but rush adapters and accessories still need to be accessed from the weapon screen. A nice little feature that's good for quick on-the-fly weapon cycling that saves a bit of time. Now while the general gameplay is still fairly old hat with some minor bits of new stuff, I can't help but notice that the game feels a bit more sluggish than in previous outings. That's probably not the right word to use, but it does move a tad slower compared to the NES games, and especially compared to the Mega Man X series, which is a much faster paced game on the same console. It's actually somewhat hard to describe, but whenever I play Mega Man 7, I always get the nagging feeling that something was off here. There's a bit of floatiness, or a bit of sluggishness, and I'm not talking about the occasional bouts of slowdown that seem to permeate throughout the game. In a way, it's the same feeling I have playing Super Mario All-Stars, a 1993 Super Nintendo release that collects the 4 Super Mario Bros. Games from the original NES system and spruces them up with 16-bit graphics and sound. On the surface, they were the same game, the mechanics of it were sort of similar, but the feel of it was off. Whether it was something in the physics or whatever the case may be, it wasn't quite the same thing as playing it on the NES. It was similar, yes, but not quite the same. And this is the same nagging feeling I get with Mega Man 7, in that it tried to recreate something that worked in 8 bits and still did a really good job of it, don't get me wrong, but it also feels somewhat out of place. But despite the odd feeling I have with this game, Mega Man 7 is still a fine Mega Man game that may have been ill-advised as far as adopting the Game Boy format of the series with its level progression, but in terms of the actual gameplay, if you're able to get past the somewhat chubby nature, slow pacing, and occasional slowdowns, what you'll find here is a fairly traditional Mega Man title that plays well, still fairly straightforward, and it does have some nice bits where, with the right weapon, a collection of weapons I feel isn't fantastic, but still adequate I suppose, I'm just not crazy about them. But the right weapon in the right situation can reveal bits and bobs that are pretty neat. Burn the trees to reveal a hidden path. Freeze the weather robot and get snow, which is useful for that sort of thing. So there's a couple neat bits like that I actually kinda like. Mega Man 7 looks like fairly average fare for a Super Nintendo title. Nothing amazing, nothing terrible, it just looks like Mega Man in 16-bit. Laid out almost the same way with the familiar Mega Man posture and the health meter on the top left. There's a more cartoonish, almost anime-ish feel to the visuals, which is somewhat complimentary, and everything looks slightly bigger now. Yeah, actually, that's the other thing that kinda irked me about Mega Man 7. Why is everything bigger and chunkier than the NES versions? I'm not just talking about the Robot Masters, who seem even more off the rails weird than any that have come before or since. Even Mega Man looks a bit heavier and chubbier. I'm wondering if he ate the wrong kind of bits to make the jump. It's odd because when Mega Man X became a thing, X wasn't a giant bulky thing, but then again, X felt a bit more spry than the old Rockman. It's something that will get rectified in Mega Man 8, at least, for whatever that's worth. Now, setting aside the chubby Mega Man observations, Mega Man 7 is a rather vibrant looking game with lots of colors, lots of nice set pieces, and a generally clean aesthetic. It doesn't do much in terms of reinventing the wheel as far as visuals are concerned. There's no wireframe things or intense Mode 7 stuff that takes place during the gameplay. It's a very straightforward, very traditional side-scrolling Mega Man thing that does enough to be presentable, pleasant looking, and not much more than that. It might not have the spectacle of the X games for whatever that's worth, or if that's even the right word for that matter, but it is a perfectly fine looking game, even if it's a bit chunky looking. In regards to sound, Mega Man 7 is... It's exactly that. The game attempts to recreate some of the classic sound effects into 16-bit form, and the results are a bit of a mixed bag. Some sound okay, some sound not okay. The rest of the sound effects are your usual collection of sound effects for random things like flamethrowers and stuff like that. But usually the first thing that comes to mind in regards to a Mega Man game, aside from the gameplay of course, is the soundtrack. Mega Man games usually have good tunes with some standout tracks that are memorable, and Mega Man 7 has some rather good tunes with a couple standout tracks that are memorable. And that's all I have. But in all seriousness, there are some nice quality tunes here, some of them befitting the stages they play in. Whether it's the playful Springman theme, or the somewhat ominous tune that opens up Wily's castle, or the secret Shademan tune that's a callback to some other Capcom game. In terms of Mega Man soundtracks, number 7 actually holds up quite nicely with nigh a single bad track in the batch. Yeah. Mega Man 7 was a victim of bad timing. Not only was it following 6 entries on the NES that people started to get tired of, if not completely forgotten about by that point, but it also had the rather unfortunate pleasure to follow the release of 2 Mega Man X games. Compared to those games, which were faster, sleeker, and in some ways more refined, Mega Man 7 felt like a step backwards. A somewhat slower, chunkier, more archaic, and perhaps unnecessary iteration from a bygone era. It's easier to look back at these games and judge them on their own merits these days since they're all old, but back in the day when they were brand spanking new, going from Mega Man X2, which was a sleek product, to Mega Man 7 in a short amount of time, even I found myself questioning the move back in the day. But you put all that stuff aside, and what you have with Mega Man 7 is a fairly decent game that took the core gameplay aspects of 8-bit Mega Man, along with some choice aspects of the Game Boy titles, give it a bit of a 16-bit shine as well as some minor exploration bits, and it turned out quite well as a whole. I'm not a big fan of the chunky visuals, even if they are somewhat decent looking otherwise. I'm not a fan of the first later format that the game adopts with the stage select. The slower than slow pacing feels a bit sluggish even by classic Mega Man standards, and this last Wily boss fight can go fly a kite for all I care, but none of that deterred from what was otherwise a rather solid offering of old school Mega Man. There's fun to be had with this 7th entry that's as well crafted and reliably functional as the rest of the classic series. If for whatever reason you like some old Mega Man games and you never got around to giving 7 a shot, then I'd say go for it. The original SNES cart might cost an arm and a leg these days, but that's why you have the Mega Man Legacy Collection 2 thing for, which is much cheaper and comes with 3 other games. So give it a whirl if you want.